Part of learning the skeletal system is looking at the various joints found throughout the body. Now, typically, when we think about a joint, you probably think about your knees, maybe your elbow, your hips, your shoulders. There's a lot of other joints throughout the body. Another name for a joint is an articulation. So to articulate is to connect with something. So an articulation is a connection, typically between two bones, but articulations can also be teeth to bone would be an articulation, or cartilage to bone is an articulation. So let's look at some basic introductions to a joint. Again, they could be two or more bones that come together, cartilage and bone, or teeth and bone. Joints can be classified two ways. One way is structurally. So what we mean by a structural classification is specifically what type of tissue is holding the two bones together. If the joint is a fibrous joint, it has no synovial cavity, which we'll talk more about in a moment, but the bones are held together by dense, irregular connective tissue. And this tissue is rich in collagen, which helps hold the two bones together. A cartilaginous joint is fairly obvious. It would be cartilage that holds the bones together. Now, if you think about joints, you probably know that cartilage is found at joints. But with cartilaginous joints, the cartilage is actually holding the two bones or more bones together. Whereas in synovial joints, there is cartilage, but the cartilage is protecting the bones. And then when we look at cartilaginous joints, the question will be, is it hyaline cartilage that holds the bones together, or is it fibrocartilage? Finally, the third structural category are known as synovial joints. These are the joints that have a synovial cavity, which is rich in fluid called synovial fluid. What holds this fluid inside the cavity is what's called an articular capsule, which is connective tissue that surrounds the articulation and contains the fluid. And one key feature to a synovial joint is going to be ligaments. It's the ligaments that are holding the bones together. So those are the structural categories. We're going to learn that, is there a joint cavity? Is there a synovial cavity? Synovial joints have these cavities. What type of connective tissue is involved? Again, for fibrous, it's a dense, irregular connective tissue. For cartilaginous, it's either fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. And then for synovial joints, it is ligaments. And if you remember, a ligament is rich in dense, regular connective tissue. Then we take a joint and we can also classify it functionally. Functional categories relate to the degree of movement that the joint permits. The three types of functional categories is synarthrotic. A synarthrotic joint is often referred to as immovable. An amphiarthrotic joint is said to be somewhat movable or slightly movable. And then finally, a diarthrotic joint is what we often refer to as a freely movable joint. And we're going to see that all synovial joints are classified as diarthrotic. They are freely movable. So the degree of movement determines what functional category a joint belongs to. Okay, we're going to begin by talking about the fibrous joints. Again, a fibrous joint has no synovial cavity, so no synovial fluid. The bones are held together with a fibrous connective tissue. More specifically, it's a dense, irregular connective tissue. There are different types of fibrous joints. Going back up. Typically, a fibrous joint is either amphiarthrotic, meaning little movement, or synarthrotic, meaning no movement. The types of fibrous joints include sutures, which we've heard of before. A suture is typically found between bones of the skull. And you'll notice here we should see a little picture showing the coronal suture in the skull. But we know that there is also a sagittal suture, a squamous suture, and a lambdoid suture. There are other sutures, but those are the major four. There are also joints called a syndesmose. These joints are also fibrous, but they tend to allow a little bit more movement. So they are often classified as amphiarthrotic. And one example is the distal tibiofibular joint. So the distal tibiofibular joint would be at the distal ends of the tibia and fibula where they articulate with one another. There's slight movement allowed at that joint. And then finally, there are a couple locations where we find what's called interosseous membranes. Interosseous means in between bones. And these are located in between the radius and ulna, as well as the tibia and fibula. Cartilaginous joints. Cartilaginous joints, as the name suggests, are held together with cartilage, no synovial cavity. They either permit little or no movement. The types include the chondroses, which are held together by hyaline cartilage. The symphyses, or a symphysis, is held together with fibrocartilage. We're really going to focus on the symphyses. We've heard of one known as the pubic symphysis, which is found holding the two pubic bones together anteriorly. So this is a piece of fibrocartilage which is actually holding these two bones together. Finally, we get to the synovial joints. And this is going to be the topic for the next video because it's going to take some time to get through the different types of synovial.